My name is Cian. If you haven't joined us before, this is a podcast for anyone who is a student and graduate or anyone who's basically trying to figure out their career. And usually we speak to graduates and we try and get their stories. And every so often we like to bring in different experts for different fields who've got different areas of expertise. We've had some great people over the last season. We had Jenny Smith, who was here about networking. We had Mark Yates, who was here about what you should do if you're not sure to do with your career. But one area we haven't focused on much has been startups. And who better to bring in to talk about startups than my guest here today, which is Kabir Bali, who has co-founded the Jumpstart company, an organization which he's going to talk about in just a moment. Actually, do you know what? Why not do that now, Kabir? Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Jumpstart?
Yeah, perfect. Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me on, Cian. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. And I definitely wouldn't describe I was an expert, but I probably was a graduate not that long ago, and I know a little bit about startups now. But yeah, a little bit about me. I graduated back in 2016. So just over 6 years ago now, which seems very strange. Spent 4 years in management consulting, so kind of straight out of university, didn't really know what to do. Saw kind of all the consulting firms, the banks at the careers fairs and on the careers websites, and thought, okay, well, everyone else is doing this, so I should probably do the same. So I spent 4 years at Monitor Deloitte doing strategy consulting. And I think back towards the end of 2019, started having some conversations with actually an old school friend of mine, Matthew Saar, and he was actually doing consulting as well, had a very similar background to myself, had done economics at university, gone into strategy consulting, and was kind of getting slightly sort of disillusioned with it. And we both were kind of thinking, well, actually, we'd like to go off and work at a startup, but how do we do it? There's no kind of jobs board where you go on and there's a list of all the different startups, and there's no kind of centralized system where you can evaluate them. It's just a very difficult world to get into, but everyone is talking about it. Everyone wants to go into the startup world, whether it's in VC financing or whether it's actually working in a startup or a scale up. That seems to be a big thing, but we both kind of found this thing quite difficult. And so we initially kind of looked at Teach First and saw, well, Teach First have done a really good job of, I guess, creating a structure and a program around teaching for young people in a way that makes it much more accessible to become a teacher and create a kind of pathway for young professionals to go down that route. And I think, I know there's some controversy about Teach First, but generally has done a pretty good job of doing that and elevating that profession for young people who've gone to university. So could we do a similar thing with startups? So we ourselves are finding it hard to get into that world. Why don't we create a structure or a program where graduates like ourselves, back 5 years ago, we didn't know what to do, but with the big corporates were there on campus. So why don't we create almost like a competitor to that, where they can go off and actually work in a startup, but still get the benefits of a big corporate, get the training, the support, the feeling of being part of a cohort, which we ourselves really valued actually working in our consulting firms, working with a group of 20 to 30 other people who are pretty similar to you can talk to, you can go have a drink with, but you can also ask them for advice on work and what you should be doing on particular projects, create that whole structure, but actually allow people to work in startups. And then the initial conception of the idea actually was that you'd rotate across different startups in the same way you do at Teach First across different schools. We kind of scrapped that, and what we do is basically create a holistic 4-week program where we immerse you in the startup world with the types of roles you're going to get and the types of companies that are out there, give you some training to help you start, and then actually start off in a company kind of full time rather than flitting between different companies, which we actually, when we delved into it, wasn't really what people wanted, either from a startup or a graduate perspective. But that's kind of where we are now. So we've been doing Jumpstart for just over 1.5 years now. So we've launched 7 cohorts. I'm happy to go into more detail about what that actually means. But yeah, that basically takes us up to October 2021.
Well, it sounds like you've had a very compact career to begin with already yourself. You fit a hell of a lot in a very short period of time, so fair play to you for that. But also fair play to you for kind of, I suppose, making that more accessible, because I think the startup world is such an interesting place for people to go into for various different reasons. And rather than me spout on why I think they're useful, why do you think they're useful for graduates as a potential career option?
Yeah, so I think what's quite interesting is if you talk to, I don't want to sort of sound like I'm creating sort of generational wars here, but talk to my parents' generation. The thing is, you go off and you go and work in a big corporate, you get a nice big blue tick in your CV, and generally that's the advice that careers service I think still do give graduates. And there's a reason for that, because traditionally those big companies give you the right training, they give you the right support. It means that you then have that kind of prestige on your CV, so you can go off and do an MBA potentially, and then go off and become a professional in another large corporate. I think that was the case, in the 90s and the 80s and the early 2000s. I think what's happened since then is that the growth in terms of the startup ecosystem has really exploded in the UK, and there's a couple of reasons for that. There's cloud computing, there's the kind of growth of apps and mobile telephony, and all that sort of thing as well. I mean, I won't go into loads of detail on that, but ultimately that world has exploded. And I think what the difference that you get from working in a startup or small organization which is growing fast to a big corporate where I was, there are probably 3 or 4 differences. One is you actually get to work on an actual product and build an actual thing. I spent 4 years in consulting. I know it's the same in banking and accounting as well. You're doing you're doing some interesting stuff, but ultimately a lot of it is you spend 6 weeks working with an interesting client, put together a really interesting kind of proposal or 400-page PowerPoint, which quite frankly no one ever reads. You never actually get to do anything. A lot of it's kind of coming with ideas which no one really listens to or looks at. And even in things like finance, you're helping, I guess, serve the economy, serve people with financial products, but you're not really building and scaling stuff. And I think working at a startup where you're actually building and creating a product, talking to customers, seeing how you can improve it, understanding the pain points, that's really, I think, the fundamentals of like what the economy is about and what working in business is. And I think working it on a product that's not only just building something, but building that's going to scale and grow quite quickly is really exciting. And it's one thing that our graduates always mention is something which is quite tangible about the work that they do. They can really feel like they're making quite a tangible impact because they are selling this hopefully exciting new way of doing things to a load of new customers or businesses. So I think that's the first thing in terms of what you're actually doing. I think secondly, in terms of I suppose progression, the progression chances, I think, pathway in a startup can be a lot more dynamic and faster than in a big corporate. I think there are 2 reasons for that. One is in terms of responsibility. So you're obviously working in a smaller organization. So by definition, you kind of do get more responsibility early on. I mean, for example, I spent, I think it was probably 8-9 months before I was allowed to actually talk to customers as a consultant. Now, if you're working in a startup, you cannot afford to really do that. You have to be, on the front line from day one, potentially owning your own projects quite early on as well. So that's one part of it, is that you're in a small organization where you get more impact, you have more impact because you are, a third of the company rather than 1/100th of the company. The other thing I think is about the growth as well. We work with startups that generally have received 1 or 2 rounds of venture capital funding, which means they're looking to grow at a very, very fast scale. So just to give you an example of one company that we work with that some of your listeners might be familiar with, Wheezy. So if you live in London or you're in Bristol as well, you'll have seen Wheezy kind of riders and billboards everywhere. We started their kind of delivery, one of the delivery apps that they're committed to delivering food and groceries in 15 minutes or under using their app. And we started working when they were about 20 or 30 people, and they're now probably over 300 or 400 people. And so I think the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th employees were actually hired via the Jumpstart program. And a couple of them are actually now basically running teams of interns and grads, in the space of 7 months, they're themselves being 22 years old. Now, that is a pretty unique opportunity because of that growth trajectory, you can actually kind of grow with the company and actually get responsibility and climb up the rungs of the ladder in a far quicker time than you would in a big corporate. So I think that's the sort of 2A and 2B, is that you get more responsibility, but you can grow in terms of your career faster. I think the third thing is actually in terms of the kind of technology that you're dealing with. A lot of consultancies and banks will talk a lot about innovation and fast-paced environments and all this stuff around blockchain and disruption. Startups are the one that's actually doing it. You're actually going to be there working with that technology. Even if you're not a technical person yourself, you're going to have to understand that world in a much more forensic way than you probably would if you were a consultant writing a report about it. So there are probably loads of other reasons, but I think those are the 3 that really stick out to me as being, what I wish I had joined a startup when I was at the start of my career, and why I generally think for graduates it's a great option.
And when you're, I suppose, dealing with graduates now, I mean, what's their mindset? Like, are they coming in knowing these things? Do they have that like education base, or are they very much just trying to figure things out as well? What's going through their minds when you're talking to them?
Yeah, and I think this is something we discussed last time. I think the biggest problem is that people just don't know anything about startups. I think when I speak to most graduates or people, they think, oh, startups, that's kind of like, guys, white males in Silicon Valley wearing hoodies and coding, which is obviously, it absolutely isn't what's happening. It's a massive industry with loads of different roles and things going. And I think that is the biggest problem with the startup world, is there's just a complete lack of understanding of what it is, what the roles are like, what the companies are. There's a lot of jargon and buzzwords, which means it's not that accessible. Historically, it has been a very closed off environment. And I guess that's why I'm here today, or why we're doing Jumpstart, is to help uncover that world. I mean, generally, most of our grads who join the program, a lot of them don't know anything about startups, and that's absolutely fine. The whole point of what we do is that we do uncover that world for them. You know, what do these terms mean? What does it mean to have a VC funding or bootstrap? What does a Series A mean? You know, what is a growth marketeer? What's a growth hacker? What is product? You know, all these terms, which quite frankly are quite confusing. We try our best to kind of myth bust, if you like, but also kind of help people understand why these are great roles and why there is a lot of progression in them as well.
What I kind of like about Jumpstart, that kind of, I suppose, stood out to me, was that you've tried to turn this on its head. Can you talk us a little bit about, I suppose, what a graduate will go through experience-wise, and how you will find them the right employer for them, or the right company for them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in terms of the program itself, it's a 4-week program, so it's selective. So once we've selected you onto the program, we normally select between 20 or 30 grads. But the 4 weeks are split into kind of 3 parts, if you like. The first part is kind of what you're referring to, which is the spotlight week, which I'll explain to in a second once I've done my overview. Week 2 is training, which is designed to kind of do 2 things: 1, get you ready for your job, but 2, kind of get you ready for interviewing at a startup, which is quite a different experience than interviewing at corporate. And then week 3 and 4 is basically the interview process, where we facilitate your interviews with the startups that we work with. And at the end of that process, you hopefully have at least 1 or 2 or even more offers from a startup. So in terms of the reverse of the process, so what we actually have discovered is that job descriptions in general are quite bad ways of explaining a role and what it's really about, but particularly in startups. So we're working with relatively early stage startups, between 15 and 20 people, and the roles that we're putting graduates into tend to be quite generalist. You're working across different functions, potentially doing lots of different things. You're not really siloed into one area. Now, that is a very difficult thing to explain on a job description, because you're basically saying you'll be doing everything, which is not particularly useful when you're a graduate working out what to do. So we sort of thought, actually, maybe a better way of doing this is actually creating a kind of pitching environment. So instead of having the startups come in and pitch to an investor, they actually pitch to a graduate. So actually the startup will come in for a 15-minute pitch, spend 5 minutes talking about the company, what they're all about, the ethos, the ethic, the mission, and then 5 minutes on the role, what examples of what they'll be doing, bringing in specific projects they could be working on, and then have 5 minutes at the end for questions. And so that's the process that we run for the first week, which we call the Startup Spotlight Week, where essentially we get between 40 or 50 startups to come in and basically deliver these 15-minute pitches to our group of graduates. And I think it's really effective for a number of reasons. One is you really get a sense of kind of the vibe and the culture of not just the company but the founder from listening to them. Even if it's a short call, I think you can really get that sense of what they're about, not just through the words they say, but also the body language they use. I think the second thing is the power aspect. Graduates are so used to basically firing off 1,000 applications and writing all these cover letters and being ghosted by a load of startups. And we thought actually it might be quite nice to completely reverse that power dynamic and actually give the power to the graduates. So what happens at the end of that week is each of our graduates basically ranks the top 3 or 4 companies out of the list of 40 that they were pitched to them, and then basically the 3 or 4 the ones that they really want to interview with, and we put them up for interviews at those 3 or 4 companies. So basically, at the end of that process, as a graduate, you get to choose. And actually, what we do is actually make the process in favor of the graduates. So we always have more startups than graduates, which mean that actually sometimes startups come away from the process empty-handed, and that's obviously a bit not ideal for them. But we actually think that's the best way to create an environment where a graduate can actually choose from a wider range of options as to where they want to go, and actually will lead to a much better match, because you're not just having to desperately scrounge around and send off an application for a job you don't actually want. You're being given an already curated list of startups, but then you're curating it yourself even more. So it tends to lead to, I guess, happier matches down the line, I think.
And I suppose, like, I love the fact that you've turned the kind of power dynamic on its head, and it sounds like a very kind of empowering process. It sounds like something that's going to really give the graduates a bit of a leg up. How did the startups find it with having that power dynamic potentially shifted? I imagine sometimes maybe don't react that well.
Yeah, look, I think with any kind of new product or service that you're offering, it is quite different from what they're expecting. So there are some startups that frankly think, no, I don't want to deliver a 15-minute pitch. I mean, our belief is that actually, if you're a startup that values, selling yourself to people and wanting, the best grads out there, you're willing to actually, put in a 15-minute pitch and get to know other graduates that are looking for jobs and actually answer their questions and actually get involved in the process, and you're willing to take that risk. So I think the ones that actually tend to get involved with the ones who buy into it and understand what we're doing. There are always going to be some who don't, but generally, actually, most startups do understand that this is actually a useful way of doing things, and they quite enjoy actually pitching to graduates and hearing from them and hearing good questions. And they actually, most of them take it quite well. There are a few maybe at the start who didn't, but I think generally now that our brand is getting stronger, people understand what we're about, and we are trying to grow the program as well. So obviously, it will allow more startups to come on board and more graduates to go through as well. So we don't have to be so I guess specific or strict on the number of startups and graduates as we are now.
If I may, I'm just curious as how you found it, because there's some irony somewhere in that it's a startup that's helping startups, that kind of way.
Yeah.
From your perspective, how have you found kind of going from that kind of corporate culture into your own startup, where you've been been thrown into this whole world, or pushed yourself into this whole world? How have you experienced it?
Yeah, I think, I maybe should explain this at the start, actually. So I, in terms of what I was doing in my consulting job, I was actually working in the kind of ventures department of my company. So the idea was that we would use the kind of the kind of lean startup techniques to help big corporates go to market quick with their products and be more customer centric, and basically apply a lot of the startup techniques to corporates to allow them to be more nimble and agile and all that sort of stuff, which was great. I actually enjoyed it, but kind of I remember thinking about it a few years and then looking around and thinking, actually, we're advising all these companies on how they should be more like startups, but we're all kind of management consultants. We've never actually built or done anything ourselves. So it kind of, I always, since that sort of moment that I had, I always wanted to actually go out and actually apply these things that I was learning about in practice, and actually do something which is not just like advising companies on things that I theoretically knew but didn't actually know in practice. So that was always the impetus that I had to do that. And I suppose before we actually launched the company, we did do a lot of research. So we'd actually created a fake website where we measured the number of clicks. So we knew that from a graduate point of view, there was quite a lot of demand for what the kind of thing that we were doing. We hadn't exactly solved it, but there was something there that was in demand from a startup perspective. I think from the startup perspective as well, we spoke to lots of startups, we interviewed them. We got a sense that actually the current way that recruitment was being done, particularly from a graduate point of view, wasn't really working. Either startups weren't really hiring grads because they didn't have a process to do it, or there was a sense that they needed too much hand holding and so they went for someone more experienced, or the whole process for themselves was just too difficult. So we already had a pretty good idea when we launched that there was some problem there that needed to be solved, but actually we quite quickly realized when we kind of quit our jobs back in May of last year that it wasn't going to be quite as easy as we thought. And there were definitely some pretty I wouldn't say dark moments, but pretty like moments we think, oh god, what am I doing? Particularly when you're sat in your bedroom during the pandemic, so cold emailing hundreds of startups and getting no responses. So there definitely were some, I guess, low moments, but we always knew, because we've done quite a lot of research, that like, okay, we might not find exactly what it is, but we know there is a problem here, and if we knock on enough doors, we'll find the right one. So that kind of, I guess, helped us through it. But there were definitely points where we just thought, oh god, what are we doing? And I think the pandemic probably didn't help that, in terms of us being stuck in our bedrooms and not being able to sort of talk to people as well.
Well, it's funny because I was just about to ask you whether you thought that potentially this was coming on at a good time, because as much as I know we're the COVID bounce back and what's going to happen, there is this real emphasis now on kind of new businesses needing just to come up out of this. And it has, so I appreciate you partly answered this in that it was difficult to start during the pandemic. Could it be an advantage long term for yourselves in terms of maybe the startup culture is going to grow in the UK and beyond?
Yeah, I actually think, although it was personally difficult for us for the reasons I mentioned, from a business perspective, we didn't plan it in any way. We didn't plan to launch the pandemic, but actually it was a pretty good thing for us. We were quite lucky, I think, because there were two reasons. Firstly, a lot of graduate employees, your BCGs, McKinseys, Goldman Sachs, etc., had often either cancelled or postponed their graduate schemes for the last year. So there were some very smart people who had got jobs at those places who were now looking for other stuff, because frankly, there wasn't anything else. So that was the first thing. Secondly, I think from a startup perspective, all the startups we work with are kind of tech focused. And I think everyone's seen over the last year and a half to 2 years that basically anything which does things using technologies, i.e. not using the humans or doing things in a digital rather than a paper-based way, have done pretty well. A lot of the startups we work with at the beginning of our journey in the summer of last year had grown 100 times over the last year. Even Zoom is obviously a good example of that as well. So generally startups are tech focused and tech companies have done well, and so as a result the startup ecosystem has done pretty well, albeit at the start there was still a lot of concerns about hiring. But once that initial hurdle had gone through, and by sort of the summer of last year, I think the sector was growing in terms of revenue and customers and market share, but also was looking to hire more as well. Obviously, adding that in with the fact that the big corporates are hiring less grads, that actually helped us a lot, I think, at the start. But there were also some other drawbacks of being in a pandemic. But generally, I think we were probably quite lucky that happened. Obviously, that's a bit perverse because obviously other terrible things were happening during that pandemic. But I think given that's the situation we were, it probably was overall a good thing for us.
So from my perspective, one of the reasons I was very keen to have you on and talk about this is that from a careers education point of view, and particularly from this podcast point of view, is that it's always, my focus has always been on trying to give people a chance to I suppose be encouraged to try new things and to kind of really try things with their careers. And I always thought the startups was a really good way of doing that, and certainly an undervalued way. And I know some universities, mine included, have kind of jumped in that more than others. I know we're kind of focusing on your company and we're focusing on the UK. I'm just wondering for anyone, because we do have people listening from all over the world as well, do you have any advice for anyone who, just generally speaking, if they want to get into startups? We're going to come back to Jumpstart in a second. We're going to finish with that. But just wondering if anyone is listening who maybe can't access it because they can't get into the country or whatever, or they don't want to move. What general advice would you have for anyone who's interested in getting into startups or into that world?
Yeah, so I think firstly, a lot of startups are working, have gone fully remote. Not all, but a lot of them have. So if you are working, living in a different country, and some startups have actually set up their businesses now that you can literally work from anywhere in the world. So I'd say that's the first thing I would say. That is a bit of a side, but I think that's probably more the case in the startup world than it is in the corporate world, I would imagine. I think if you're interested in startups, a great resource that I would encourage them to use is Crunchbase. So Crunchbase is basically a massive database of startups across the world, and you can basically search on it by place, by industry, by size, and you can go on it and you can basically come up with a list of all the companies that fit what you're looking for, and you can find them on LinkedIn and you can find their websites. And so if you're interested in the sphere but don't know that much about it, it might be a good thing just to go on Crunchbase, have a bit of play around. If you find a company that you think is really interesting, reach out to the founder of LinkedIn. It should be easy to find via the Crunchbase site. And startup founders are generally pretty active on LinkedIn. They're always posting there, so that's a pretty good place to find them. And if you're interested in having a chat, they're generally pretty good at reaching out and talking about something they're passionate about, which is their product or service. The other thing is in terms of other publications, Sifted is pretty good if you don't know that much about the startup world and just want to get more knowledge about what's going on. Sifted is particularly in the EU is a pretty useful resource, and TechCrunch is another one which is quite good if you want to kind of get a global overview. Another really useful website, I think, for people if they want to just find out more about like what is the startup way and like what is this startup thing all about, the startup method, and is the Y Combinator website. So Y Combinator is the kind of world-renowned incubator and accelerator program where Airbnb and Stripe have gone through it, and they have they've kind of created a framework for how you can build and scale a product. So if you're not necessarily an entrepreneur, but are kind of interested in entrepreneurialism, their website's a really good starting point. They've got some really interesting videos about creating products and doing customer interviews. And even if you're just a student and who's kind of interested in the space or interested to how you might create a business, I think that's a really good place to start.
Well, thanks for that. There's a couple of resources I hadn't heard of there, so I'm definitely going to be checking those out out of interest. So along with the when we publish this, there'll be links to your website down below. But I'm just wondering, what is there anything else people should know about, if they're going to any tips about kind of if they're applying or anything that they should know before they kind of decide to put an application in with yourselves?
Yeah, so I think actually in terms of the start, obviously I've been sat here kind of really, I guess, advocating for startups. But I think the one thing I would say to people who are looking for this route is there are some big differences between the corporate and the startup route. If you like a very structured environment where when you go into work what's going to happen, and it's quite not predictable, but it's fairly kind of set out before you, and your pathway set out before you, a bit like it is at school and university. The corporate route is actually very good for that, and you will get some great training along the way. But if you want something where you want to generally be challenged every day, and that frankly, there will be a bit of anarchy and chaos, and you like that, you're excited by that, then the startup world is for you. But I would say to people, not everyone is suited to that, and that's fine. But I think it's just important for people to know that before, going into that thing, because it might be that actually you prefer that structure, and that's fine. You should definitely consider the corporate route probably is more applicable. But that's just the first thing I'd like to say before going into the process. But in terms of our application process, we have 3 stages. So the first stage is a CV CV screen. Second is a series of written questions, and the third is a final interview, which lasts about 45 minutes. So in terms of the CV stage, we've done quite a lot of analysis on this, and actually what we do is we don't look for work experience, which is probably what most people look for. We've actually worked out that the biggest predictor of success in a startup is basically people who are very proactive. So people who've done lots of extracurricular things at university, whether it's sport, music, getting involved in charities, running their own societies, people who have shown a bit of hustle, I would say, is a really important predictor of success in a startup. As I said earlier, in a startup, you don't really have the option to wait for things to happen to you. You kind of need to go out and get it done yourself. You can't wait for someone to say, this is job X which needs to be done. You need to work out yourself what job X is, because actually, you know, you're working in a dynamic environment where speed is important, and there's not necessarily the time for someone to go and tell you exactly what you need to do each day. So we really look for, you know, academics is important, but really that proactivity is the key thing that we look for on an application, and that generally is in the form of extracurricular work. You know, work experience is good, but generally we know that work experience can skew towards particular socioeconomic backgrounds, so we try and focus on extracurricular, which is a better predictor. Written questions, so we have a series of quantitative and qualitative type questions that are really assessing your ability to analyze information, but also kind of write effectively and communicate effectively, which we test for. And then the last stage is a 45-minute interview with myself or my founder. And it consists of one a case study, which we send you kind of a few days beforehand, which you have to work on and present back to us, a few kind of competency questions and just getting to know you type questions. And then we kind of give you a final unseen case study at the end as well. So it's a relatively kind of quick, straightforward process. And we run an application, so we run a cohort every 2 months roughly. So our next one is starting on the 15th of November, and the next one will be kind of in January next year. So there's a cohort every 8 weeks, so you can just select whichever one you want to be considered for.
And really importantly as well, because you mentioned about kind of not skewing things towards certain socioeconomic backgrounds. One thing I did like about it as well is that there's no charge for the students for this when they're applying for it. There's there's nothing like that, which I think is a really great thing. Kabir, I think we've covered everything. Feel free to jump in while I'm summing things up if I haven't. But thank you so much. You've been brilliant for coming on. Wish you the best of luck. And and if anyone's listening, and if you're interested, the links to the website are in the description. And as always, if you haven't already, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, what else are we on? TikTok. Please do, and please share the episodes, particularly this one, because obviously, as I said, we want to do a bit more about startups, given everything that's going on at the moment. Kabir Bali, thank you so much. You've been a gentleman.